The San Francisco skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, its glittering lights reflecting like diamonds against the glass. Inside the penthouse, laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses echoed against polished marble floors. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms weaved through the crowd, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes. It was a scene right out of a luxury magazine, opulence personified, effortless perfection. And yet, Alexander Pierce felt utterly alone. He stood near the grand piano, a glass of scotch in one hand, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him like armor. His piercing blue eyes swept the room, a room filled with people who all, in one way or another, owed him something. They laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, complimented him a bit too eagerly, and hung on his every word. It should have felt powerful, intoxicating even. But to Alexander, it was all white noise. The rooftop party had been Clara's idea, his go-to event planner and stylist. "You need to be seen, Alexander," she had insisted. "People need to know you're still on top." As if there had ever been any doubt. He took another sip of scotch, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. His penthouse, perched atop one of the city's most exclusive towers, was a fortress of glass and steel. Every detail, down to the imported Italian tiles and the rare art pieces, screamed wealth. Yet the space felt colder than ever tonight, despite the throng of glamorous guests. "Alex, my man!" a voice called out, slicing through the hum of conversation. Alexander turned slightly, a controlled smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Liam Carter approached, his old friend, or perhaps more accurately, his oldest rival, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. Liam, dressed in a navy blue suit that was just a bit too flashy, exuded the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. "You really know how to throw a party," Liam said, handing him a glass. "I have people for that," Alexander replied coolly, but he accepted the drink anyway. Liam laughed, but there was something sharp in his eyes. "Still as charming as ever." They stood in silence for a beat, both surveying the crowd. A model with a diamond choker waved at Alexander from across the room, her smile hinting at promises she wouldn't make for free. "Tell me, Alex," Liam said, swirling his champagne, "doesn't all this—" He gestured broadly to the penthouse, the guests, the endless supply of champagne, ever feel hollow? The question caught Alexander off guard. He masked it with a smirk. "This coming from the man who just bought a yacht bigger than my living room?" Liam chuckled but didn't back down. "Touché. But seriously, you ever wonder if any of this actually means anything? The parties, the money, the people?" Alexander's jaw tensed. He didn't like where this conversation was going, because the truth was, yes. He thought about it more than he cared to admit. The long nights when the penthouse was empty, the constant nagging feeling that no one in his life saw him as anything more than a bank account with legs. But vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I'm not here to play philosopher," Alexander replied curtly. Liam leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make it sound like a secret. "Of course not. You're here because you need everyone to believe you've got it all together, that the great Alexander Pierce is untouchable." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What's your point, Liam?" Liam smirked, his tongue resting on the edge of a dangerous idea. "I think you're bored. All this money, all this power, and you're still empty inside. So, I've got a little challenge for you." Alexander arched an eyebrow, his interest piqued despite himself. Liam was known for his reckless bets, the kind that tested boundaries and bruised egos. "Go on," Alexander said, his voice low. Liam's grin widened. "I bet you can't do something real. I bet you can't step outside of this bubble you've built and actually connect with someone. Someone who's not part of this world. No models, no influencers, no trust fund babies. Alexander took a slow sip of his scotch, already calculating the angles. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Liam's eyes sparkled with mischief. "I bet you, 10 million, that you can't find an ordinary woman, someone from the other side of the tracks, and make her your wife, publicly, for 3 months. No scandals, no shortcuts. Just you, her, and the world watching." The room's noise seemed to fade into the background, the weight of the bet hanging heavily in the air between them. Alexander chuckled, the sound hollow. "You're joking." "I'm dead serious," Liam said, clinking his glass against Alexander's. "You claim money can buy anything, even love. Prove it." For a moment, Alexander hesitated. It was a ridiculous idea, cruel even. But then he saw the smug satisfaction on Liam's face, the unspoken accusation that Alexander was nothing more than a man hiding behind his wealth. His pride, his most dangerous weakness, took the bait. "Deal," Alexander said, his voice cold as steel. Liam's grin widened. "This is going to be fun." As Liam melted back into the crowd, Alexander caught his own reflection in the vast window behind him, the cityscape stretching into forever, his face cast in shadows. For the first time in a long time, he didn't recognize the man staring back. The night carried on around him, laughter, music, the hollow echoes of a life built on power and privilege. But Alexander felt something different stir within him, a flicker of unease, a question he wasn't ready to face. What happens when the game stops feeling like a game? He downed the rest of his scotch and turned back toward the party, the weight of the bet heavy on his shoulders, though he would never admit it. Not yet. The morning sun filtered through the expansive glass walls of Alexander's penthouse, illuminating every polished surface and curated piece of art. Yet, despite the warmth outside, the air inside remained cold and sterile, an architectural marvel with all the soul of a museum. Alexander sat at the kitchen island, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him, though he hadn't taken more than a sip. His laptop screen displayed spreadsheets and stock reports, but his mind was elsewhere. The echoes of Liam's dare from the night before still reverberated in his head. "I bet you, 10 million, that you can't find an ordinary woman, someone from the other side of the tracks, and make her your wife." It had been a stupid bet, impulsive and reckless, but now the challenge gnawed at him. Losing wasn't an option, not to Liam. And so Alexander did what he always did, approach the problem like a business deal. His housekeeper, Mara, appeared silently, beginning her morning routine of tidying the already immaculate space. But it was the younger maid, the one he'd noticed at the party last night, who caught his eye. She was wiping down the marble counters in the adjoining living area, her movements quick and efficient, almost invisible. Emma Collins. She'd been there the night before, quiet, unnoticed by the crowd, except by Liam, who gestured subtly in her direction when the bet had been made. "Someone like her," Liam had sneered, his voice full of disdain. Emma's dark hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, a few strands falling around her face. Her uniform, plain black slacks and a white blouse, looked too big on her slender frame. She moved with precision, but there was a heaviness in her posture, like she carried more than just the weight of the cleaning supplies. Alexander observed her for a beat longer than he should have. There was something about her, an authenticity that stood in stark contrast to the glittering world he lived in. "Emma," he called out, his voice cutting through the silence. She startled, nearly knocking over a vase. She turned, her hazel eyes wide, a flush creeping up her cheeks. "Mr. Pierce," she said quickly, setting the vase back into place. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "It's fine," he interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "Come here, I need to talk to you." She hesitated, glancing at Mara, who gave her a subtle nod before retreating. Emma approached, wiping her hands on her apron, visibly nervous. She stood a few feet away, eyes downcast. Alexander studied her, noting the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes and the small calluses on her hands, details that most would overlook. But not him. Not today. "I have a proposition," he began, leaning back in his chair, his tone businesslike. Emma blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "A proposition?" "Yes, I want you to marry me." For a second the world seemed to freeze. Emma's jaw slackened, her brows knitting together as if trying to process what she'd just heard. Then she laughed, a short, incredulous sound. I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me," he said, calm and detached. "A marriage. Not real, of course. More like an arrangement. 3 months. You'll act as my wife in public, attend events, smile for the cameras, and play the part." Emma's mouth opened and closed, searching for words. "Is this some kind of joke?" "I don't joke," Alexander replied flatly. He pulled out a checkbook from a drawer, scribbled a number on it, and slid it across the counter. Emma hesitated before glancing down at the paper. Her breath caught. The number was staggering, more money than she could dream of seeing in a lifetime, let alone earning. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Why me?" Alexander hesitated. He could hardly tell her about the bet, not yet. "You fit the profile," he said vaguely. "You're not part of this world. That's the point." Emma's face flushed deeper, a mixture of anger and humiliation swirling in her eyes. "So, I'm just some charity case to you? Someone to parade around like a project?" Alexander's jaw tightened. Her words hit harder than he expected. "It's a business transaction. You need money. I need a wife. Simple." "Simple?" she echoed, her voice rising. "You think I can just sell myself off like that?" He stood, his imposing figure towering over her, but his voice steady. "I know you're struggling. I did my homework. Your brother, he's 17, right? Smart kid. College applications coming up. You're behind on rent, medical bills. It's all there." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, pride flickering across her face. "You had me investigated?" "I had to make sure I could trust you," he replied, softening just a fraction. "Emma, I'm offering you a way out. 3 months. No strings after that. The money is yours. Enough to take care of your brother, pay off your debts, and start fresh." Silence stretched between them. Emma clenched her fists at her sides, the weight of her reality crashing down on her. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to walk away. But the thought of her brother, working double shifts just to keep them afloat, rooted her in place. She exhaled shakily. "And after the 3 months?" "We go our separate ways," Alexander replied. "No drama, no press." Emma closed her eyes, the enormity of the decision sinking in. She was standing on the edge of a precipice with only 2 choices: dive into the unknown or stay stuck in a life that was slowly drowning her. When she opened her eyes, her gaze was steady, fierce even. "Fine, I'll do it." Alexander's lips curved into the faintest smile, a mix of satisfaction and something deeper he didn't recognize yet. "Good. We'll make the arrangements." But as Emma turned away, her shoulders stiff with tension, he couldn't shake the strange, hollow feeling that settled in his chest. The game had begun. But neither of them could see just how high the stakes would become. The sleek black town car hummed quietly as it wound through the streets of San Francisco, carrying Alexander and Emma toward the city courthouse. Raindrops began to spatter against the tinted windows, turning the morning's brightness into a muted haze. Inside, the air between them was thick with tension, heavy and silent. Emma sat rigid in the back seat, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress, hastily purchased that morning with a stylist Alexander had sent to her tiny apartment. Her long, dark hair was pulled back in a low bun, wisps framing her face, softening the sharpness of her expression. Alexander, in contrast, was composed, his custom-tailored suit immaculate, his expression neutral as he scrolled through emails on his phone. But even he couldn't ignore the occasional glance Emma shot his way, her mix of wariness, anger, and something else. Something raw. She finally broke the silence. "So, is this how you do all your business deals? Pick someone desperate and throw money at them until they say yes?" Alexander didn't look up. "It's not personal, Emma. It's a contract. You agreed to the terms." Her jaw tightened. "Right. A business arrangement." She paused, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Do you even realize how humiliating this is?" Alexander sighed, setting his phone down. For a brief moment, his cool facade faltered. "You think this is easy for me? I'm putting my reputation on the line here." Emma scoffed, crossing her arms. "Your reputation? Oh, poor you. How will you ever survive?" He clenched his teeth but didn't respond. Instead, he gazed out the window, watching as the city passed by. People walking under umbrellas, going about their normal lives. He wondered briefly what it would be like to be one of them, free from the weight of wealth, the constant calculations, the endless expectations. The car pulled up to the courthouse steps, the imposing stone building looming against the gray sky. The driver opened the door, and Alexander stepped out first, extending a hand to Emma. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers cool against his palm. Inside, the courthouse was sterile and quiet, the sound of their footsteps echoing off marble floors. Alexander's attorney, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit named Richard, was already waiting, documents in hand. "Mr. Pierce, Miss Collins," Richard greeted, his tone all business. "Everything is in order. We just need signatures." Emma's heart raced as she stared at the thick stack of papers. She reached for the pen but paused, her hand trembling. This isn't how I imagined getting married," she murmured. Alexander's gaze softened just for a second. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? This was all wrong, yet here they were. "You're free to walk away," he offered, though even as he said it, he knew she wouldn't. She couldn't. Emma's eyes flicked to the check sitting in the folder, a life-changing sum. Enough to pay off her debts, send her brother to college, maybe even buy a small house. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders. "I'm not doing this for you," she said quietly, meeting Alexander's gaze. "I'm doing this for my brother." He nodded once, understanding. "I know." With that, Emma signed her name on the dotted line, her heart heavy with every pen stroke. Alexander followed, his signature flowing smoothly, like it was just another business deal, because to him, it was. The officiant arrived shortly after, a stern woman who barely glanced at them before beginning the brief ceremony. Emma barely registered the words. Her mind swirled with doubts, fear, and an overwhelming sense of loss. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, no celebration, just a cold, perfunctory nod from Alexander and a sharp stab in Emma's chest. Richard handed them copies of the marriage certificate, his voice crisp. "Congratulations, you're now legally married." The word married echoed in Emma's mind like a cruel joke. They left the courthouse in silence. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain, casting a gray pall over the city. Emma stepped into the car, feeling an unfamiliar heaviness in her chest. As the car pulled away, Alexander finally spoke, his voice low. "We have an event tomorrow night, a charity gala. You'll need to be ready. Clara will handle your wardrobe and appearance." Emma didn't look at him. Of course. Wouldn't want me embarrassing you. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, frustration and guilt churning within him. This will be easier if we're both on the same page. Emma turned her head sharply, her eyes burning with unshed tears. There's no same page, Alexander. You bought me. That's all this is. Her words cut deeper than he expected, but he said nothing. The car sped through the rain, carrying them toward the life they'd agreed upon. A life built on lies and contracts, but one neither of them realized would change them forever. Emma stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror in the walk-in closet, its walls lined with designer gowns, shoes, and accessories, all delivered that morning, hand-picked by Clara Bennett, Alexander's renowned stylist. The space was larger than her entire apartment, and it felt suffocating. She tugged at the silky fabric of the dress she wore, a soft, champagne-colored evening gown that hugged her in ways she wasn't used to. It was elegant, stunning even, but it wasn't her. Emma Collins didn't belong in dresses like this, in a world filled with glitz and carefully curated images. She was a maid, a caretaker, someone who scraped by, paycheck to paycheck. But now she was Mrs. Alexander Pierce, at least on paper. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, smoothing the dress down awkwardly. The door opened, revealing Clara, her tailored black pantsuit pristine, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun. She carried a clipboard, her sharp eyes immediately sweeping over Emma. "Not bad," Clara said, approaching with a professional air. "But we need to fix the hair, and those shoes won't do." Emma shifted uncomfortably in the stilettos she'd barely managed to stand in. "I feel ridiculous," she admitted. Clara's expression softened just slightly. "This world has its rules, Emma. Appearances matter, but it's not about becoming someone else. It's about showing them you can belong." Emma swallowed hard. "I don't want to belong." Clara sighed but didn't push further. "Tonight's the gala. It'll be your first appearance as Alexander's wife. High society will be watching." She paused before adding, "Be prepared. People in this world can be unkind." Emma didn't need the warning. She already felt the weight of invisible eyes judging her. The grand ballroom at the St. Regis Hotel was a swirl of shimmering gowns, black tuxedos, and the soft hum of classical music played by a string quartet in the corner. Glittering chandeliers cast golden light over the sea of San Francisco's elite, CEOs, influencers, politicians, all mingling with crystal flutes of champagne in hand. Alexander stood tall near the entrance, his black tuxedo perfectly tailored, exuding effortless power. Yet his mind wasn't on the business deals or handshakes tonight. It was on the woman standing in the town car just outside, undoubtedly debating whether to bolt or come in, and then he saw her. Emma stepped into the room, the champagne gown hugging her curves, her dark hair styled into soft waves that framed her delicate features. Her eyes, however, were wide with nerves, flicking around the room as if searching for an escape route. Alexander crossed the room to meet her, suppressing the flicker of something he couldn't name that tightened in his chest. "You look stunning," he said, the words surprising even himself. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. "I feel like I'm in a costume." "Good," he replied curtly, falling back into his default businesslike demeanor. "That's what this is." Her shoulders stiffened at his words, but she nodded. She knew the terms. He offered his arm, and she hesitated before taking it, her fingers resting lightly on the crook of his elbow. Together they stepped into the heart of the gala, every eye turning to them. Conversations faltered as the couple passed. Whispers followed. Speculation, judgment, curiosity. "Who is she? Did Alexander marry her? She looks ordinary." Emma felt every word like a pinprick against her skin, but she lifted her chin, remembering Clara's advice. Appearances matter. She could survive this. She had to. At the center of the ballroom, Alexander guided her toward a group of impeccably dressed individuals. She recognized Liam Carter almost instantly, his smile sharp as a knife, though his eyes sparkled with amusement. "Alexander," Liam drawled, raising a glass, "and this must be the new Mrs. Pierce." Emma forced a polite smile. "Emma," she introduced herself, extending a hand. Liam took it, his grip lingering a beat too long. "Pleasure to meet you, Emma. You're certainly unexpected." Alexander's jaw ticked, but he said nothing, feeling Emma tense beside him. "I was just telling the group how Alexander never ceases to surprise us," Liam continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tell me, Emma, how did you two meet?" Emma opened her mouth, but Alexander spoke first, his tone ice-cold. "That's not important, Liam." But Emma, her pride flaring, refused to be silenced. "I was cleaning his penthouse," she said, her voice calm but steady. "I guess I was in the right place at the right time." A beat of silence followed, and then, unexpectedly, Liam laughed. "Well, isn't that romantic?" The group chuckled politely, but Emma saw the judgment in their eyes. She excused herself moments later, needing a breath of fresh air. She stepped onto the balcony, the cool evening breeze a relief against her flushed skin. Her hands gripped the railing as she stared out over the cityscape. "I thought you handled that well." Alexander's voice came from behind. Emma didn't turn. "I'm not a puppet, Alexander." "I know." She finally faced him, her hazel eyes fierce. "You think I don't know what this is? I'm here to be your perfect little wife, to play the role, make you look good, but I'm not going to let people walk over me." For a moment, Alexander said nothing, and then, to both their surprise, a small smile tugged at his lips. "You're stronger than I thought." Emma exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling within her. "You don't know anything about me." His smile faded, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. Fleeting, but real. "You're right," he admitted quietly. They stood in silence, the city lights glittering below. For a brief, fragile moment, something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of the roles they were both trapped in. And then, just as quickly, the moment passed. "We should go back inside," Alexander said, his mask slipping back into place. Emma nodded, but as they walked back into the lion's den, she couldn't shake the feeling that, beneath his cold exterior, Alexander Pierce was hiding more than she realized. And perhaps, so was she. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses echoed through Alexander's penthouse, but Emma barely noticed. She sat in front of the expansive mirror in the walk-in closet, still in the champagne-colored gown from the gala. Her reflection stared back at her, flawless makeup, perfectly styled hair, but she barely recognized the woman looking at her. The evening had been a brutal reminder of where she didn't belong. Every glance, every whispered comment, had cut deeper than she'd expected. She had thought she could handle it, that the money would make it all worth it, but the weight of the charade was heavier than she'd imagined. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she murmured, expecting Clara or one of the stylists. But it was Alexander. He leaned against the door frame, his tuxedo jacket draped over his arm, the top buttons of his shirt undone. For the first time since she met him, he looked almost human, less like the perfect cold businessman and more like a man worn down by the world. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Emma let out a bitter laugh. "What do you think?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I know tonight was difficult." Difficult? She stood, turning to face him. That's one word for it. Do you have any idea what it feels like to be in a room full of people who think they're better than you? Who look at you like you're dirt on their designer shoes? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room and poured 2 glasses of wine from the crystal decanter on the side table. He handed one to her, and despite herself, Emma took it. They don't matter, he said simply. Emma scoffed. Easy for you to say. You're one of them. His jaw tightened at that, but he didn't argue. You held your own tonight. You didn't let them see they got to you. That's not the point, Alexander. I shouldn't have to hold my own. I shouldn't have to prove myself to people who think their money makes them better. For a long moment he was silent. Then softly he said, You're right. The admission surprised her. She blinked, searching his face for any trace of sarcasm, but there was none. For the first time he seemed sincere. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. This whole charade. Why me? He hesitated, swirling the wine in his glass. He couldn't tell her about the bet. Not yet. You were unexpected, he finally said. Someone who wouldn't play by the rules. Someone who wouldn't pretend. Emma let out a hollow laugh. And yet here I am, pretending. Their eyes met, and for a brief, fragile moment, the tension between them shifted. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was something softer, something unspoken. But the moment shattered when Alexander's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, his face hardening. I have to take this. Emma watched as he disappeared into his office, the warmth of their brief connection already fading. She sat back down, her heart heavy. This wasn't just a contract anymore. It was messy, complicated, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending it didn't hurt. Alexander paced in his office, his phone pressed to his ear. Yes, Liam, what is it? Liam's smug voice crackled through the line. I saw the pictures from tonight. You and Emma looked convincing. I'll admit, I'm impressed. Alexander clenched his jaw. This isn't a game, Liam. Oh, but it is, Liam said smoothly. And you're playing it well. But remember the terms, Alex. 3 months. Let's see if you can keep her on your arm that long. Alexander ended the call abruptly, his chest tightening. He hated that Liam was right. This had started as a game. But tonight, seeing Emma standing up for herself, watching her navigate a world that had been built to break her, something had shifted. He wasn't sure if he was still playing the game, or if the game was now playing him. Later that night, Emma stood on the penthouse balcony, the city lights stretching out beneath her. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cool breeze brushing against her bare shoulders. She heard the sliding glass door open behind her. I thought you'd gone to bed, Alexander said. She didn't turn. I couldn't sleep. He joined her, leaning against the railing. For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the city filling the space between them. I meant what I said earlier, he began. You were strong tonight. Emma sighed. I'm tired of being strong. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? She hesitated before answering. My whole life has been about survival. Taking care of my brother, working 2 jobs, sacrificing everything just to keep our heads above water. Her voice wavered. And now I'm here, pretending to be someone I'm not. For money. I hate it. Alexander was silent, his guilt twisting in his chest. She didn't deserve this. None of it. I never meant to make things harder for you, he said quietly. She turned to him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Then why did you pick me? He hesitated, the truth sitting on the tip of his tongue. But instead he said, because you're real. In a world where everyone is pretending, you're the only one who isn't. It wasn't the full truth, but it was close enough. Emma's gaze softened, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man behind the billionaire facade. And it scared her. Because despite everything, the lies, the contract, the charade, she felt something stir inside her, something dangerous. Hope. The soft morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of Alexander's penthouse, illuminating the modern, sterile decor with a warm, almost deceptive glow. Emma sat at the oversized kitchen island, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of her. She stared at the shimmering city skyline, trying to make sense of the whirlwind her life had become. Everything felt surreal. The marriage, the gala, the way Alexander had looked at her last night on the balcony. There had been something in his eyes, something deeper than the cold, detached man she thought she knew. And that scared her more than anything. "Good morning." Alexander's voice echoed through the open space, pulling her from her thoughts. Emma glanced over her shoulder to see him entering the kitchen, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his tie hanging loosely around his neck as he adjusted his cufflinks. He looked as if he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, perfectly put together, while she sat there in one of Clara's silk robes, feeling entirely out of place. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft. He moved to the coffee machine, pouring himself a cup before taking the seat across from her. For a moment they sat in an awkward silence, the hum of the city below filling the void. I wanted to thank you," Alexander began, his voice surprisingly gentle. Emma raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For last night. You handled yourself well. I know that world isn't easy." She let out a dry laugh. "You mean the world where everyone looks at me like I'm some charity case you picked up off the street?" Alexander winced, the sting of her words hitting harder than he expected. "I didn't mean for it to be like that." "Then what did you mean, Alexander?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "You brought me into your life, into this charade, and expected me to just go along with it like I belong." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't expect this to be easy, for either of us. But we made an agreement." "An agreement," she repeated bitterly. "Right. A contract. Just business." But the words tasted sour on her tongue because deep down, she knew it wasn't just business anymore. There had been moments, small, fleeting moments, where she saw a different side of Alexander. A man who wasn't entirely made of cold steel and sharp edges. "I have a meeting downtown," Alexander said, standing up and grabbing his briefcase. "There's a charity event tomorrow evening. Low key. It'll be good for appearances." Emma crossed her arms. "Of course. Wouldn't want the media thinking we're not the perfect couple." He paused at the doorway, his shoulders tense, but he didn't look back. "Clara will help you get ready." And with that, he was gone, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft click, leaving Emma alone in the cavernous space. She sighed deeply, burying her face in her hands. How had she ended up here? How had she allowed herself to be dragged into this mess? Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced down to see a text from her younger brother, Noah. "Noah, how's the new life, sis? Are you okay? You don't have to pretend with me." A lump formed in her throat. Noah was the reason she was here, the reason she'd agreed to this ridiculous arrangement. She quickly typed back. "Emma, I'm fine. Everything's good. Don't worry about me. How's school?" "Noah, I'm doing fine, but I miss you. It's weird not having you around." Her heart ached. She missed him too, missed the simplicity of their old life, even with all its struggles. "Emma, I'll visit soon. Promise." She set the phone down, her chest tightening with a mixture of guilt and longing. Later that evening, Emma wandered through the penthouse, the silence weighing on her. She found herself in Alexander's office, a sleek, modern space filled with shelves lined with books and artifacts. It was the only room that felt personal, as if it actually belonged to someone. Her fingers traced the edge of his mahogany desk when her eyes caught a framed photo tucked behind a stack of papers. She picked it up. It was a picture of Alexander, much younger, standing next to a woman, his mother perhaps. They both smiled brightly, but there was something haunting in Alexander's eyes even then, a sadness she hadn't noticed before. "You're not supposed to be in here." His voice came from behind her. Emma jumped, nearly dropping the frame. She turned to see Alexander leaning against the doorway, his tie now gone, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the tension in his forearms. Sorry, I was just—" "It's fine," he interrupted, walking over and gently taking the frame from her hands. He set it back on the desk before sighing. "That was my mother, before things got complicated." Emma hesitated before asking, "What happened?" He looked at her for a long moment, as if debating whether to tell her. Then quietly he said, "She left when I was a teenager. Couldn't handle my father's world, the wealth, the power plays, the lies. She walked out and never came back." Emma's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. I'm sorry, Alexander." He shook his head. "It's in the past." But Emma knew better. Pain like that didn't just disappear. It lingered, buried deep beneath layers of wealth and status, festering. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said softly, echoing Noah's earlier words. Alexander met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them, an understanding, fragile and delicate. "I could say the same to you," he replied. For a moment the walls between them cracked just enough to let something in, something real. But then, just as quickly, they both retreated, stepping back into the roles they'd agreed to play. "Dinner will be served soon," he said, his voice once again cold and detached. Emma nodded, but inside, her heart twisted. Because the more she saw beneath Alexander's surface, the harder it became to remember that this was all supposed to be just business. The soft hum of the city filled the air as Emma sat alone on the penthouse balcony, a glass of red wine in hand. The city lights twinkled like stars beneath her, but even their brilliance couldn't pierce the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The conversation with Alexander earlier had left her unsettled. For the first time since this arrangement had started, she'd seen a crack in his cold, perfect exterior, a glimpse of the man beneath the mask. But what scared her most was how much she wanted to see more. The sound of sliding glass doors broke her thoughts. She turned to see Alexander approaching, 2 wine glasses in hand, his expression softer than usual. "You've been out here for hours," he said, offering her a fresh glass. She hesitated before accepting it. "It's peaceful out here," she replied, staring back at the glittering skyline. "It almost makes me forget how complicated everything is." He sat down beside her, their knees almost touching, though neither acknowledged the proximity. "Complicated seems to be the theme lately," he muttered, taking a sip. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't as tense as before. There was something gentler in the air, a fragile truce of sorts. "Why do you do it?" Emma asked suddenly, turning to face him. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" "All of this. The parties, the appearances, the constant pretending. It must be exhausting." He leaned back, staring at the night sky. "It's expected. When you have money, there's a certain image you have to uphold. People don't care about the man behind the image. They care about what the image represents." Emma frowned. "But aren't you tired of it? Don't you ever just want to be real?" He hesitated, the question hitting closer than she realized. "I don't remember how," he admitted softly. The vulnerability in his voice startled her. For a man who always seemed in control, hearing that sliver of honesty was unexpected and heartbreaking. She placed her wine glass down and turned toward him, her voice gentler. "It's not too late, you know." He met her gaze, something raw flickering in his eyes, but before he could respond, the sound of the elevator chiming broke the moment. Both turned as the penthouse doors opened, revealing Liam Carter, dressed impeccably as always, a cocky grin spread across his face. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Liam said, stepping into the room with an air of entitlement. Emma stood up, tension radiating through her. "What are you doing here?" Liam's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Just thought I'd drop by. Old friends and all." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he forced civility. "It's late, Liam. Late enough for the wine to be flowing and secrets to be spilling, I see." Liam's gaze flicked between them, amusement dancing in his eyes. Emma crossed her arms, her patience thinning. "What do you want, Liam?" Liam's smile widened. "Just checking in on the happy couple. I've heard whispers. Seems like you two are getting rather cozy." Alexander stood, his posture tense. "Enough games, Liam." "Oh, come on," Liam chuckled. "We all know what this is. A facade, a little performance for the cameras." Emma's face flushed with anger. But before she could respond, Alexander stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You need to leave." But Liam wasn't done. His eyes zeroed in on Emma, his tone turning venomous. "Careful, Emma. Don't get too comfortable. We all know how this story ends." Emma's chest tightened, the weight of Liam's words settling deep within her. But before she could speak, Alexander grabbed Liam by the arm, dragging him toward the elevator. "I said leave." Liam smirked but didn't resist. "Touchy, aren't we? Just remember, Alex, lies have a way of catching up." The elevator doors slid shut, leaving a heavy silence behind. Emma stood there, her heart racing, the fragile trust she'd started to build with Alexander now cracking under the weight of Liam's words. Alexander turned toward her, his face filled with a mixture of anger and guilt. "I'm sorry about him." But Emma's walls were already rebuilding, the vulnerability she'd started to feel moments ago now hardening. "Is he right?" she asked quietly. Alexander froze. "About what?" "That this is all just a game to you. That I'm nothing more than a pawn in whatever twisted thing you and Liam have going on." His silence spoke louder than any words could. Emma's throat tightened. "I knew this was a mistake." Without another word, she turned and walked inside, leaving Alexander standing alone on the balcony, the city lights now feeling dimmer than ever. Emma's footsteps echoed through the marble-floored hallway as she stormed away from the balcony, her heart pounding like a drumbeat in her chest. She could still hear Liam's smug voice reverberating in her mind. "We all know how this story ends." His words felt like venom, seeping into the cracks of her already fragile trust. She entered the guest room, her room, though it was laughable to even call it that. It was a far cry from the tiny, worn apartment she had shared with her brother Noah, yet the cavernous space felt even emptier. She slammed the door behind her, but the act did little to block out the emotions swirling inside. Leaning against the doorframe, Emma pressed her palms into the cool wood, taking deep breaths, but they came out shaky. Was Liam right? Was she nothing more than a pawn? And worse, had she started to fall for the illusion? A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Emma," Alexander's voice came through, low but laced with tension. She didn't respond. "I know you're upset, but let me explain." His words made something inside her snap. She whipped open the door, glaring at him. "Explain what, Alexander? That this whole thing is a joke to you? That I'm just part of some sick game between you and Liam?" He stood there, clearly caught off guard by the rawness in her voice. but his jaw clenched in defense. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" Her voice cracked, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You knew from the beginning what this was, a business arrangement. Nothing more." The words were like a slap to her face. She knew this. She had agreed to it, but hearing him say it, so coldly, so bluntly, made it feel all the more devastating. "But it doesn't feel like that anymore," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Alexander's features softened for a moment, but his guarded walls quickly went back up. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud this. He had built his entire life on control. "I'm sorry if this has gotten complicated," he said, his voice measured. But there was something underneath, a crack in the surface. "But we both agreed to this arrangement. You get the money. I get the image I need." Emma's heart twisted at his words. She had thought, hoped, that maybe, somewhere between the fake smiles and staged public appearances, something real had started to bloom. But maybe that had all been in her head. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Is that all I am to you? An image?" Alexander hesitated for a beat too long, and that was all the answer she needed. She stepped back into the room and pushed the door closed, the finality of it echoing in both of their hearts. The next morning, Emma barely slept. Her mind kept replaying the night, the anger, the heartbreak, the sinking realization that maybe she had been foolish to think Alexander could ever be anything but the cold, calculated man she had met. Yet, as she sat at the breakfast nook, nursing a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "Clara, charity luncheon at noon. We'll need to get you ready by 10 a.m. Don't be late." Emma sighed. The machine never stopped, not even for broken hearts. By the time Clara arrived, Emma had already prepared herself mentally, slipping back into the role she had reluctantly signed up for. The gown chosen for the luncheon was elegant but understated, a soft lavender that contrasted against her pale skin and the dark circles beneath her eyes. Clara noticed but said nothing. Instead, as she pinned up Emma's hair, she finally broke the silence. "You know," Clara began, her voice careful, "you're not the first person to get caught up in Alexander's world and feel lost." Emma glanced at her through the mirror. "What do you mean?" Clara sighed, placing the hairpins down. "I've been working in his world for years. I've seen how these people operate, how they hide behind money, power, and control. But Alexander—" She hesitated. "He's different. Not better necessarily, but complicated." Emma snorted bitterly. "Complicated?" "That's one word for it." Clara placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I see how he looks at you. He tries to hide it, but there's something there. But he's also a man trapped in his own web of lies." Emma's heart ached at Clara's words, but she pushed them aside. She couldn't afford to hope. Not again. The charity luncheon was held in a sun-drenched glass atrium filled with the city's elite. Waiters floated by with trays of champagne, and small talk buzzed in the air. Emma stood beside Alexander, the perfect image of a loving wife. But beneath the surface, the tension between them was palpable. Every time their hands brushed, it felt like electricity and ice all at once. As they moved through the crowd, Emma noticed a group of women, elegantly dressed, watching her with barely disguised disdain. One of them, a tall blonde in an emerald green dress, approached with a tight smile. "Emma, isn't it? I'm Victoria. I went to college with Alexander." Emma forced a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." Victoria's eyes sparkled with condescension. "You're very brave stepping into this world. It's not easy to keep up with certain expectations." Emma's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "I'm doing just fine." Victoria leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. You know, darling, we all have our roles to play. Just be careful. People like Alexander don't usually play fair. Before Emma could respond, Alexander appeared at her side, his hand resting lightly on her lower back, sending a confusing jolt through her. Victoria, he said, his voice clipped. I think that's enough. Victoria smiled sweetly. Of course, lovely seeing you, Alex. And with that, she sashayed away. Emma stiffened under Alexander's touch, but before she could move away, he whispered, Don't let them get to you. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with emotion. It's not them I'm worried about. And with that, she stepped away, leaving Alexander standing alone, surrounded by a sea of people, yet somehow more isolated than ever. The evening sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows over the polished marble floors. Emma stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she poured herself a glass of water. The charity luncheon had been a disaster. Victoria's biting words echoed in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Just be careful. People like Alexander don't usually play fair. She had brushed it off in the moment, standing her ground, but now, in the quiet solitude of the penthouse, the weight of those words crushed her. She had begun to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something real between her and Alexander. But that hope was starting to feel like a cruel joke. The sound of the elevator chiming pulled her from her thoughts. She quickly set down her glass and straightened her dress as Alexander entered, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked tired, his usual polished facade slightly cracked. Yes, I'll handle it, he said curtly into the phone. I don't care what the board thinks. This is my decision. He ended the call and turned to see Emma standing there, her arms crossed over her chest. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension in the room was palpable. You left early, he said, breaking the silence. She narrowed her eyes. Can you blame me? That woman, Victoria, made it painfully clear how people see me. Alexander sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Victoria is irrelevant. Emma took a step forward, her voice trembling with emotion. But I'm not. I'm the one standing here, pretending to be your wife while everyone whispers behind my back. His jaw clenched, the weight of her words sinking in. This isn't easy for me either. She let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I'm so sorry it's hard for you, Alexander. You get to play your part and go back to your perfect life while I get to be the joke of the room. His defenses began to rise. You agreed to this. I didn't agree to this, she snapped, her eyes glistening with tears. I didn't agree to feeling like I was nothing, like I'm disposable. The room fell into a heavy silence, and then Emma's eyes caught something. Papers scattered on the dining table, some half hidden under files. Curiosity and dread mingled in her chest as she approached the table. She picked up one of the papers, her eyes skimming over the cold, clinical words. Contractual agreement between Alexander Pierce and Emma Collins. Her heart stopped. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling, and there it was, details about the arrangement. Not just the money, but terms about appearances, behavior, and most damningly, a clause about the bet. It was veiled in legal jargon, but the meaning was crystal clear. This was all a game? She whispered, her voice cracking. Alexander's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. She slammed the papers down, fury overtaking her heartbreak. Was this the plan all along? Make a fool out of me? Was it fun, Alexander? Did you and Liam have a good laugh about it? Emma, he started, his voice strained, but she cut him off. Don't, she hissed, tears now streaming down her face. Don't you dare try to explain this. His heart pounded in his chest, guilt suffocating him. It started as a bet, yes, he admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. But it stopped being that a long time ago. She let out a hollow laugh. Oh, how romantic. You used me, Alexander. You let me think. Her voice broke. You let me think this was real. It became real, he said, his voice desperate now. You changed things, Emma. I didn't expect it, but I... Stop, she choked out, backing away from him. I don't want to hear this. The walls that had started to crumble between them were now fortified again, stronger than ever. I need to go, she whispered, turning towards the door. Emma, please, he called after her, but she didn't stop. The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped inside, pressing the button frantically. As the doors began to close, their eyes met, his filled with regret, hers with heartbreak. And then she was gone. Alexander stood there, alone in the massive penthouse that suddenly felt too big, too cold. He walked to the balcony, gripping the railing as the city lights blinked beneath him. He had won the bet, but he had lost everything that mattered. Emma sat on the edge of her small, worn-out couch, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the peeling paint on the walls of her old apartment. The place she had once called home now felt foreign, claustrophobic even. The silence buzzed in her ears, louder than the honking cars outside or the neighbors' muffled arguments. She had escaped the sterile coldness of Alexander's penthouse, yet she had brought a different kind of emptiness with her. The paper she had found still haunted her. The bet, the contract, the humiliating realization that every glance, every word, every gentle touch had been part of a calculated game. And worse, she had fallen for it. The sound of the front door creaking open snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts. Her brother, Noah, entered, his backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds dangling around his neck. He froze when he saw her sitting there, her face pale, eyes puffy from crying. "Emma, what are you doing here?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. "I thought you were... with him." She forced a weak smile but couldn't hold it. The tears broke free again. Noah rushed over, sitting beside her. "Emma, what happened?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, trying to compose herself. "It was all a lie," she whispered. "Everything. The marriage, the promises. It was a bet." Noah frowned, his teenage bravado melting away into empathy. "A bet?" She nodded, her voice cracking. "He made a deal with someone, to marry someone like me. I was just part of his game." Noah clenched his fists, anger flashing across his features. "I'll kill him." Despite herself, Emma let out a weak laugh, tears still streaming. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I think he's already destroyed himself." There was a beat of silence before Noah spoke again, softer this time. "Do you still care about him?" The question landed heavy in her chest. She wanted to scream no, to say she hated Alexander, but the truth clawed at her. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. I thought I saw something real in him. I thought maybe, behind all that coldness, there was a man who actually cared." Noah wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Maybe there is, but that doesn't excuse what he did." Emma rested her head against her brother, letting the comfort of the moment wash over her. She had spent so long being the strong one, the caretaker, that it felt almost alien to be the one needing support. Across the city, Alexander sat at the edge of his massive, now empty dining table, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. The penthouse felt hollow, each tick of the clock echoing through the space like a reminder of his mistakes. He had tried to call her, multiple times, each one going straight to voicemail. His mind replayed the moment she found the papers, her eyes filled with betrayal, her voice shaking with heartbreak. He had thought he was in control, that he could manage the emotions, the lies, the outcomes. But he hadn't accounted for Emma, for how real it had all become. A knock echoed through the penthouse. Alexander didn't move, thinking perhaps it was his assistant or Clara, but when the knock came again, sharper this time, he stood and walked to the door. Liam stood there, leaning against the frame with his usual smug grin. Alexander's jaw clenched immediately. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Liam shrugged, stepping inside uninvited. "I heard about the little fallout. Figured you'd need a drinking buddy." Alexander slammed the door shut behind him. "I don't need anything from you." But Liam's grin didn't falter. "Oh, come on, Alex. You knew how this was going to end. You're not exactly the poster boy for emotional depth." Alexander crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing Liam by the collar and shoving him against the wall. "You ruined everything." Liam laughed bitterly. "No, Alex, you did. You were the one who made the bet. You were the one who turned a woman's life into a game." Alexander's grip faltered, the weight of Liam's words sinking in. Liam pushed him off, straightening his jacket. "The difference between you and me? I never pretended to be the good guy." He walked to the bar, pouring himself a drink. "But you actually started to care about her, didn't you?" Alexander didn't answer. Liam chuckled darkly. "You poor bastard." Alexander's hands trembled as he spoke. "I did care." "I do." Liam raised his glass mockingly. "Well, cheers to that." Without warning, Alexander knocked the glass from Liam's hand, the liquid shattering against the floor. "Get out," he growled. Liam's grin faded slightly, but he didn't argue. He walked to the door, pausing before leaving. "You might want to fix things with her, if you can." The door slammed shut, leaving Alexander alone in the suffocating silence once more. He knew Liam was right. This was on him, all of it. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander Pierce felt truly, utterly lost. Emma sat on the windowsill of her apartment later that night, staring at the glowing city skyline. Somewhere out there, Alexander was probably doing the same. She traced circles on the fogged glass with her fingertip, her heart heavy but conflicted. Her phone buzzed beside her. Another missed call from Alexander. She hovered her thumb over the screen but let it fall back into her lap. Not yet. Her heart wasn't ready for answers. Not yet. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, with thick clouds stretching over the San Francisco skyline. Emma stood by the kitchen sink in her apartment, staring absently out the window as she washed dishes. Her hands moved mechanically, scrubbing at plates that didn't really need cleaning. Her mind, however, refused to stop racing. Every moment from the past few weeks replayed in her head like a cruel movie. Alexander's first cold proposal, the staged galas, the whispers, the contract, and the bet. The sharpest memories, though, were the softer ones. The moments she hadn't expected, the way Alexander's eyes softened when he talked about his mother, the warmth of his hand on hers when no one was watching, the brief glimpses of vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. A part of her still wanted to hate him. It would be easier that way. But another part, the stubborn, foolish part, ached. Her phone buzzed on the counter again. Another message from Alexander. "Alexander, please, just give me 5 minutes. I need to explain." She sighed deeply, wiping her damp hands on a towel. It was the 3rd message this morning, and she had ignored the last 10 calls. But this one? Something about the simplicity of it tugged at her. She pressed her lips together, debating. Against her better judgment, her fingers moved to type. "Emma. Fine. 5 minutes, that's all." Before she could second-guess herself, she hit send. 2 hours later, she found herself standing in front of a small community center on the edge of the city, The place where she had volunteered before her life became entangled in contracts and luxury parties. She clutched the strap of her purse tightly, nerves jittering through her. Alexander had sent the location without much explanation, simply saying, "I need you to see something." The heavy oak doors creaked as she stepped inside. The scent of old books and fresh paint filled the air, mingling with the faint chatter of children from a nearby room. It took her a moment to notice Alexander standing by a large window, gazing out over the community gardens outside. He turned as she approached, his suit more casual than usual, his tie loosened. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now held something softer, a mix of regret and hope. "Emma," he said, his voice low. She crossed her arms, her guard firmly in place. "You have 5 minutes." He swallowed hard, nodding. "I deserve that." There was a beat of silence before he spoke again. "I know I hurt you. I know there's no excuse for what I did. The bet, the lies, all of it." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his features. "I was stupid. I treated your life like it was part of some game." She didn't respond, her jaw tight as she fought back a surge of emotion. "But somewhere along the way," he continued, his voice trembling slightly, "it stopped being a game for me, and I didn't know how to fix it without ruining everything." Emma looked around the community center, trying to piece together why they were here. "Why did you bring me here, Alexander?" He took a deep breath. "Because this place is yours, or at least it will be." She blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" He gestured toward the building. "I've been working with the city council. I donated enough to save this center, expand it, fund its programs for the next 10 years, and I've arranged for a scholarship fund in your name, for kids in the neighborhood, kids like Noah." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Why?" she whispered. He stepped closer, his voice raw. "Because it's the one thing I could do that isn't about me. It's about you, about making something right." Her heart ached as she tried to process his words. "You think money fixes this? That donating a building erases everything you did?" "No," he admitted, his shoulders slumping. "It doesn't. But it's a start. I don't want to buy your forgiveness, Emma. I want to earn it." Tears prickled at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wanted to believe him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice, but the wound was still fresh, raw. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. "I understand," he replied, his voice breaking slightly, "but I'll keep trying." A long silence stretched between them as she processed everything, the weight of his gesture, the rawness of his confession. Finally, she asked, "Why did you take the bet in the first place?" He hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because I was empty. I didn't realize how hollow my life was until I met you, and by the time I figured it out, it was too late." Her chest tightened. It was the first real truth she had heard from him without any walls. She took a shaky breath, wiping a tear that had managed to escape. "I need time, Alexander." His face softened, hope flickering in his eyes. "I'll wait, as long as it takes." She turned to leave, her heart a storm of emotions, but as she walked away, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. He stood there watching her, alone, but different. Maybe, just maybe, there was something worth saving after all. The soft murmur of the city filtered through the windows of Emma's apartment, but it felt distant, muted. She sat on the worn couch, legs curled beneath her, staring at the cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Alexander's words from the community center echoed in her mind, tangled with emotions she couldn't quite unravel. "I don't want to buy your forgiveness, Emma. I want to earn it." She had seen the sincerity in his eyes, the rawness in his voice, and the community center, the scholarship fund. It was more than just a grand gesture. It was a piece of him laid bare, an attempt at redemption. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? Her thoughts were interrupted by the front door creaking open. Noah entered, kicking off his shoes, his face flushed from his afternoon basketball game. "Hey," he called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "You okay?" Emma forced a small smile. "Yeah, just thinking." Noah plopped onto the couch beside her, grabbing a bottle of water from the coffee table. "About Alexander?" She hesitated, then nodded. There was no use pretending. "He stopped by my school today," Noah said, glancing at her. Emma's head snapped up. "What?" "Yeah, didn't make a scene or anything. He just talked to my coach, donated some new equipment for the team, and left. Coach said he didn't even want recognition." Noah paused, watching her carefully. He looked different, like he actually cared. Emma's heart twisted. She hadn't known about that. Alexander hadn't told her. "I don't know what to do, Noah," she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even herself. "He hurt me. Badly. But I also see the man he's trying to be, and I can't tell if it's real or just another performance." Noah took a sip of his water before answering. "You always told me people can change, that sometimes they just need someone to believe in them." He shrugged. "Maybe he's finally trying." Emma's chest tightened. She had told Noah that countless times, especially when life had felt unforgiving. But this was different. This wasn't about someone else. This was her heart on the line. "I'm scared," she admitted. Noah placed a hand on her shoulder. "You should be, but sometimes the scary stuff is what's worth it." His words lingered long after he left the room, heading to the shower. Across town, Alexander sat in his office, staring at the cityscape through the towering windows. Papers were scattered across his desk, contracts, mergers, deals, but he couldn't focus on any of them. All he could think about was Emma. The community center had been a step, but her eyes that day, filled with so much pain, haunted him. He knew he couldn't undo the damage, couldn't erase the hurt, but maybe, just maybe, he could show her that his feelings were real. His phone buzzed. "Clara. The board is pushing back on the community center donation. They think it's too off-brand for the company. What should I tell them?" Alexander's jaw clenched. His board had always been focused on image, profit margins, and optics, but for once he didn't care. "Alexander, tell them I don't give a damn about the brand. The donation stands. No negotiations." Moments later, another message came through. Liam. "Saw the news about the community center? Trying to play hero now? Good luck with that." Alexander didn't bother replying. He was done with the games. The following evening, Emma found herself standing outside the community center once more. It was bustling with life. Children laughing, families gathered, the sound of basketballs thumping on the court. She watched from a distance, her heart caught in her throat. "Emma?" She turned to see Clara approaching, dressed in a sharp blazer but with a warmth in her eyes that Emma hadn't noticed before. "I didn't expect to see you here," Emma said. Clara smiled gently. "I wasn't sure you would come." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the activity around them. "Alexander really put everything into this," Clara began. "More than just the money. He's been here almost every day working with the city council, overseeing the renovations. He didn't do it for the press. No cameras, no headlines. Just for you." Emma's throat tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara hesitated, then answered, "Because I see the way he looks at you. And I've known Alexander for years. I've seen him at his worst, his most detached. But with you, he's different." Emma swallowed hard, emotions swirling. I don't know if I can forgive him. That's your choice, Clara said softly. But I think he's finally becoming the man he was always meant to be. Before Emma could respond, Clara gave her a small nod and walked away, leaving her standing there, torn between the past and the fragile hope of something more. She took a deep breath and walked toward the community gardens. Alexander was there, kneeling by a freshly planted bed, helping a group of kids dig in the soil. His sleeves were rolled up, dirt smeared on his hands, a far cry from the polished billionaire she had first met. He looked up and saw her. Their eyes met, a storm of emotions passing between them. Pain, regret, hope. He stood, wiping his hands on a towel, but didn't move closer. He let her come to him. Hey, he said, his voice low, filled with nerves. Hey, she replied. Silence stretched between them, thick but not unbearable. I heard about the school, she said finally, and the equipment. You didn't have to do that. I know, he admitted, but I wanted to. Emma hesitated before speaking. I don't know where this leaves us, Alexander. His shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. I understand. But, she continued, her voice trembling, I can see you're trying, and that means something. Hope flickered in his eyes. I'll keep trying, as long as it takes. For the first time in days, a small, fragile smile tugged at the corner of Emma's lips. Okay, she whispered. And for the first time, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something real. The sun dipped low over the San Francisco skyline, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. Emma stood on the balcony of Alexander's penthouse. Her fingers curled around the delicate stem of a wine glass, though she hadn't taken more than a sip. The city stretched before her, vast, glittering, alive. But all she could feel was the whirlwind of emotions that had been building inside her since that afternoon. Alexander had been different these past few weeks. Genuine, raw. She had seen the shift in him. The man who had once hidden behind cold stares and calculated decisions was now showing cracks, letting light and humanity seep through. But still, the scars from his betrayal lingered, a constant shadow over the fragile connection they were trying to rebuild. Behind her, she heard the soft click of the balcony doors opening. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. Emma. Alexander's voice was gentle, almost hesitant. She took a deep breath, then turned to face him. He stood there, dressed simply in a white button-down shirt and dark slacks, no tie, sleeves rolled up, a far cry from the perfect billionaire persona he usually wore. I didn't expect you to come tonight, he continued, stepping closer. Emma tilted her head. You invited me to celebrate the community center's opening. I know, but after everything... His voice trailed off, his uncertainty hanging heavy between them. I'm here, she said softly. That has to mean something. They stood in silence, the tension between them thick, but not unbearable. It was a strange limbo, a place between what they had been and what they might become. Alexander stepped forward, placing a small velvet box on the balcony table between them. Emma's heart quickened, her mind racing. What is this? She asked, eyeing the box. He took a deep breath, the vulnerability in his eyes stark. It's something I should have given you that day. The right way. Emma hesitated before opening the box. Inside sat a simple but elegant diamond ring, nothing ostentatious but beautiful in its understated design. Her breath caught in her throat. Alexander. I know I can't undo the past, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I know I hurt you in ways I may never fully make up for. But I also know that somewhere along the way, all of this stopped being a game for me. It stopped being about the bet, about proving something to Liam, or even about the contract. Emma's fingers trembled as she closed the box, setting it aside. "Why now?" she asked, her voice raw. "Why tell me this now?" "Because," he said, stepping closer, "tonight was supposed to be our wedding night, the real one. The night we actually celebrated the beginning of something meaningful. But instead, it became a lie, built on a foundation of deceit." He paused, searching her eyes for any trace of forgiveness. "I need you to know that I was going to stop the bet," he continued. "Before Liam told you, I had planned to end it, to tell you the truth. I couldn't keep lying to you, not when I had fallen for you." The confession hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Emma's heart raced, tears welling up despite herself. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, some filled with anger, others with heartbreak. But never like this. Never with Alexander standing in front of her, completely vulnerable. "You were going to stop it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded. "Yes, but I was too late." She swallowed hard, her emotions warring inside her. Part of her wanted to scream, to remind him of the pain he had caused. But another part, the part that still cared, couldn't ignore the sincerity in his voice, the rawness in his eyes. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she admitted. "I don't expect you to," he replied, his voice soft. "But I'm willing to wait, for as long as it takes." Emma turned away, leaning against the balcony railing as tears slipped down her cheeks. The city lights blurred before her, a shimmering sea of gold and silver. She felt Alexander move beside her, the warmth of his presence both comforting and overwhelming. "Do you remember the first night you stayed here?" he asked gently. She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "How could I forget? I felt like a fish out of water." "I noticed," he smiled slightly. "But you still held your head high. You never let this world break you, Emma. That's what drew me to you." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "And what about now? What do you see?" He hesitated, then cupped her cheek gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I see the woman who changed me, the woman who made me want to be better." Her breath caught, her heart cracking open in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase the pain. But it was real. And sometimes that was enough. "I can't promise anything," she whispered. "I'm not asking for promises," he replied. "Just a chance." They stood there, the city below them buzzing with life, while the space between them grew smaller, no longer filled with lies and games, but something fragile and real. And for the first time, Emma allowed herself to hope. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of Emma's apartment, casting soft patterns on the walls. She sat at the small kitchen table, a cup of coffee warming her hands, but her mind was far from the familiar surroundings. Her thoughts kept returning to the balcony from the night before, Alexander's raw confession, the simple diamond ring, and his broken yet sincere eyes as he bared his truth. The emotional storm inside her had yet to settle. She had seen the man behind the polished billionaire mask, stripped of the arrogance and control. For the first time, Alexander had allowed himself to be vulnerable. It was that honesty, not the grand gestures or wealth, that had cracked the walls around her heart. A soft knock echoed at the door, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated before standing, a mix of nerves and curiosity swirling inside her. When she opened it, Alexander stood there, holding 2 paper cups of coffee and a small bakery bag. He looked human. No tailored suit, no perfectly styled hair, just a simple navy sweater and jeans. For a man who had built his life on appearances, this version of him felt disarmingly real. "I thought you might need a decent cup," he said with a small, tentative smile, holding out one of the cups. Emma blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the gesture. She accepted the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her hands. "You didn't have to." "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." She stepped aside, allowing him in. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in with the weight of their shared history. He placed the bag on the table and sat across from her. There was a pause, the air thick with unsaid words. "I've been thinking," Emma started, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, "about everything you said last night." Alexander's shoulders tensed, his hands wrapped tightly around his cup. "And?" She sighed. "I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again. What you did, it cut deep." "I know," he said, his voice low. "I hate myself for it." "But," she continued, her heart pounding, "I see the man you're trying to be. And I think part of me wants to believe you can change." His eyes flickered with hope. "I can. I will." Emma looked down at the coffee between her hands. "This can't go back to what it was. I won't be a pawn in anyone's game ever again." Alexander nodded firmly. "I'm not asking for that. I just want a chance to show you I'm not the man who made that bet." She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Then let's start over. No contracts, no games. Just real." His face softened, a genuine smile forming, the first she'd seen without a trace of performance. "I'd like that." A flicker of relief washed through her, though it didn't erase the hurt. Trust wouldn't come overnight. But there was a path forward, however fragile. A few days later, Emma found herself standing in front of the community center again. The grand opening was in full swing. Kids running around the playground, families exploring the new classrooms, laughter echoing through the crisp afternoon air. She spotted Alexander on the far side of the garden, kneeling by a raised flower bed, helping a group of kids plant herbs. He was laughing, genuine, carefree. It was a version of him she'd never seen before, and the sight stirred something deep in her chest. "Hey," Clara's voice came from beside her, breaking her thoughts. Emma turned to find the stylist-turned-friend watching her with a soft smile. Clara had been a quiet constant through the chaos, offering advice and compassion without ever prying too deep. "I see him differently now," Emma admitted, her eyes still on Alexander. "It's strange." Clara chuckled. "It's not strange. It's hope." Emma let out a breath. "He's changing. Because of you," Clara added. "He's letting himself feel things he's ignored for years." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "But is that enough?" Clara placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Only you can decide that." Emma nodded, her gaze drifting back to Alexander. After a moment, she crossed the garden, her heart racing with every step. Alexander stood up as she approached, brushing dirt off his hands. His smile widened when he saw her. "You made it." "I said I would," she replied softly. They stood there, surrounded by the buzz of families and children. But for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of emotion, "for giving me this chance." She hesitated, then reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. One day at a time. His grip tightened, hope shimmering in his eyes. And for the first time since their tangled, messy story began, the space between them felt filled not with lies or betrayal, but with the possibility of something real, something worth fighting for. The late afternoon sun bathed the community garden in a golden glow, the laughter of children mingling with the gentle hum of the city in the background. The newly planted beds bloomed with vibrant flowers and fresh herbs, and families gathered around picnic tables, enjoying the simple yet meaningful opening celebration. Emma stood at the edge of the garden, watching Alexander help a young boy tie up tomato plants. He was kneeling in the dirt, his tailored suits replaced by rolled-up sleeves and muddy jeans, his face relaxed and open in a way she had rarely seen before. There was a quiet humility about him now, a man no longer hidden behind the fortress of wealth and status, but someone who had found purpose beyond the walls of his penthouse. She couldn't help the warmth that spread through her chest. The man who had once used her as a pawn in a shallow game had become someone who now fought for things that mattered, who had learned to value connection over control, authenticity over appearance. Emma felt a hand rest gently on her shoulder. She turned to see Clara, her friend and confidant, smiling softly. "You did this, you know," Clara said. Emma shook her head. "Number he did. I just showed him what he was missing." Clara's smile widened. "And in the process, you found something too." Emma nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. She had grown too, learned her own worth, her strength, and most importantly, that she didn't need to sacrifice her values for love. As the sun dipped lower, Alexander stood and dusted off his hands. When he caught sight of Emma, his face lit up. He crossed the garden, stopping in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "Hi," he said, breathless. "Hi," she replied, her heart fluttering. He glanced around, noticing the last few families packing up. The golden light danced between them, the air filled with the sounds of life and hope. "Emma?" he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. How we started, how much I've messed up, and how lucky I am that you gave me a second chance." She bit her lip, emotions bubbling to the surface. "Alexander?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. But this time it wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was simple. A modest wooden case, worn smooth from being held too often. Her breath caught as he opened it, revealing a delicate gold band set with a single small diamond. Elegant, understated, perfect. "This isn't part of a game," he said, his voice breaking. "No contracts, no bets. I'm not asking you because I feel I have to. I'm asking you because I can't imagine my life without you. Not the version filled with penthouses and deals, but the life I've found here, with you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, her hand trembling as he reached for it. "I love you," he said simply. "The real kind. The kind I didn't even know I was capable of. And I know I hurt you, and I'll probably screw up again, but I promise I'll never stop trying to be the man you deserve." For a moment, Emma stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. She looked at the ring, beautiful not for its size or sparkle but for what it symbolized: his growth, his vulnerability, and his love. She let out a shaky breath, tears streaming freely now. "I never thought I'd say this, but yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alexander." Relief washed over his face as he slid the ring onto her finger, his hand shaking with emotion. He stood and she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. They held each other tightly, the ghosts of their past finally laid to rest. As they pulled apart, Emma looked into his eyes. "You know this doesn't mean I'll go easy on you," she teased. He laughed, the sound deep and full of joy. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Weeks later, their wedding wasn't the grand spectacle that society had expected. It wasn't held in a glitzy ballroom or covered by the tabloids. Instead, they married in the same community garden where their journey had come full circle. Emma wore a simple ivory dress, her hair flowing in soft waves. Alexander stood beside her, beaming, in a crisp but casual suit. Clara officiated, surrounded by the kids from the center, families from the neighborhood, and even Noah, who gave an awkward but heartfelt speech that made everyone laugh. As they exchanged vows beneath the string lights draped across the garden, Emma realized how far they'd both come. It wasn't about the wealth, the power, or the games anymore. It was about this. Two imperfect people who had found something real in the most unexpected way. And as Alexander kissed her, sealing the promise they'd rebuilt from broken pieces, Emma knew, this time it was forever.